So this happened in 2004 while I was working at a wilderness therapy program for troubled youth in Utah. I was in the girls' group working with 4 other staff: Raquel, Katie, Velina and Jake. We were camped a little too close to a road about 1.5 miles up from where it ended, at a major road that led out of the field. Our site was about 12 miles south of Dugway, a military base well known amongst conspiracy theorists and UFO enthusiasts. The girls in the group at the time were all on solos, and had been for the better part of a week, and we had a couple of new students who required most of our attention. We woke up the day before staff exchange and decided that as an end-of-the-week activity, we were going to take a short day hike to a spot on the mountainside where there appeared to be a cave. In fact, we had a bit of a debate about whether it was actually a cave or a large juniper tree casting a dark shadow on the face of the cliff behind it. But either way, cave or large tree, we were going to hike up there and check it out. Getting ready to go, however, was no simple matter, as there were all manner of camp duties to be done before we could set out. The new girls were slow at everything, and by the time we left camp it was pushing 5 o'clock in the evening, but still plenty of time for the 2.5 mile hike to the cave or tree and the 2.5 miles back. As staff, we felt certain that if it were to get dark before we made it back to camp, all we would have to do was hike south to the road and then follow it down till we hit our camp. It was the end of August, so we had about 4.5 hours of sun, and then maybe 45 minutes of twilight before it got really dark. We had plenty of time. We set out cutting a trail more or less straight through the sage and juniper, heading directly for the dark hole in the face of the mountain. Right away the hills rose up, blocking our view of the cave until we would get much closer. Immediately upon leaving camp, one of the new girls began to fall behind. She didn't complain as much as some of the others had when they were new, but the rest of them complained about the slowness of the pace, as though they had always loved hiking quickly. We took several sitting breaks on our way there, and it was during one of those rests that I had my first premonitions of that the cave was not a good idea. I suddenly had the thought that if it were indeed a cave with any depth to it, it might be a bad place to take a group of accident-prone teenage girls. As I was thinking that thought, Katie turned to me and voiced her concern that there might be a mountain lion living in the cave, and that we might be better off just going up the mountain to watch the sunset. Jake chimed in and said that if there were a mountain lion living in that cave, it would definitely clear out of the area as soon as we got close enough for it to smell us. I told them of my fear, that the cave might be a deep one, and that the girls might get lost in it or fall into a pit. We kind of all laughed nervously and agreed to be careful, and talked each other into continuing our outing. A little ways on, during another sitting break, Raquel turned to me and voiced her concern that we would get lost in the dark if we kept taking so many breaks. I wasn't worried about that. Though I had never specifically been to the cave before, I knew the surrounding terrain really well. Besides, I had the campsite locked into the GPS if it came to relying on that, which it never would. Still, I talked with the girls and told them that we were not stopping again unless we absolutely had to. 200 yards later, as we sat listening to the new girl calling her name and waiting for her to be finished, pretending to go pee behind the brush, I looked down where I was sitting. Strangely, there was a perfect circle of red dirt about 6 feet across in the middle, of which was a small anthill. The rest of the desert surrounding the circle was the same hard-packed grey-brown earth that stretched around us for miles. I wished, not for the last time that night, that I had brought a camera with me. As we waited, I stood and went a little ways from the group and did our nightly call-in to the backup man. I struggled to acquire a satellite signal, but after a few minutes I was finally patched through. I reported that all was well and that we were day hiking to the cave on the west side of the Sheep Rock Mountains. As I was hanging up and placing the phone in the lockbox, Velina approached me. Dan, I don't know how to say this, but I don't have a good feeling about going to that cave. I know, I said. You are the third person to tell me that you don't feel good about it. But I think we ought to go and at least check it out. No one has been there yet, and if it's dangerous, we won't let the girls go in. Besides, this way we'll be able to warn the others to stay away from it. She looked skeptical. Don't worry, I assured her. We'll be okay. If it is too deep, or there is something living in it, we will stop the girls from going in and we'll leave. Velina still didn't seem entirely satisfied with my answer, but she let it go. After all, there wasn't really a better way to spend the last evening of our rotation on the trail. The truth is, I wasn't comfortable with my answer either. I couldn't place the sensation, but I was beginning to feel something between a nervous tension and a cold dread as we slowly made our way closer to the cave. Something wasn't right, but we were going to go anyway. The last mile of the hike was the hardest. The hills were steep and sandy, and the trees clawed at us and fought us every step of the way. Surprisingly, the new girls seemed to be in a much better mood. We got closer to our goal, and suddenly we could see it again, looming much larger, directly up the hill from us. It was definitely a cave. As we came closer, we saw that we couldn't approach it from where we were because a sheer cliff of about 40 feet, invisible from our campsite, but quite real up close, dropped down from the cave into a sort of sandy depression where we stood. There was a way up, however, to the right, along a steep incline that curved, bowl-shaped, around to the level where the cave floor stood. I stared up at the tree that blocked much of the opening from the side. It was huge, 3, maybe 4 times the size of any other juniper tree I'd ever seen. The cave was no small opening either. It was round like an amphitheatre, and about 30 feet across, and at least that high. I couldn't see anything wrong from where I was standing, but I suddenly had the urge to run and not look back. The girls, however, were already climbing, and so I followed. We had made it. It was almost 8 o'clock. That had been, and remains to this day, the slowest day hike of my time on the trail. We were just about to walk up the final embankment and into the mouth of the cave, when we heard it, very loud and very close to where we stood, 3 long, mournful calls. I can only guess to sound like those of a dying bird. But this was patently not a bird. It was a person imitating a bird very close to where we were standing, but hidden in the brush somewhere on the hillside. We looked at each other as staff, and then over at the girls, and we were surprised to see that it was almost as though they didn't even hear the cries. Then from the distance out on the valley floor, 3 long bird cries answered. My breath caught in my throat. Someone else was out there. The girls were at the mouth of the cave now, and we silently sped to catch up with them. But when we did, something strange happened. They all kind of looked at the opening and then dispersed. Not one of them set foot into the cave. They followed the hillside around, and most of them sat down and above the cliff to watch the sunset behind the mountains on the other side of the valley. We staff, unfortunately, were not as disinterested, but perhaps if we had been, what followed would have never happened that night. The cave, it turned out, was not particularly deep, only 50 or 60 feet, but it stayed pretty wide and open all the way to the back wall, where it finally narrowed down to a little crack in the mountain. Near the opening were the weathered remains of what had once been a dwelling of some forgotten desert culture. I had been first into the cave, and was all the way at the back where the light was low. Velina and Jake were with me, and were looking at a scattered assortment of clean white bones. These were the bones of medium to large animals, and my first thought was, so a mountain lion does live here after all. He has been after the rancher's sheep. But as my eyes adjusted, I became less satisfied with that explanation. I stooped down and had a closer look. These bones had not been gnawed or broken. In fact, they weren't even scattered as it had first appeared. These bones were cut, with a saw, and stacked carefully in neat little piles. I stood up so fast I hit my head on an outcropping of rock. I stumbled backwards into the more open area of the cave, feeling sick, just in time to hear Raquel say in a low, panicked voice, "We have to get out of here, right now." I looked at her and the others. They were all white and staring at something behind me. I turned around and saw there, carved into a wall, a low, narrow shelf. On the shelf was the deep, unmistakable colour of freshly dried blood. I backed up quickly, and just as quickly wished I hadn't, because the light and the view was better. Plastered to the wall with a paste of what looked to be blood and feces were knotted mats of long, dirty human hair. Where there was no hair, there were faces painted in white ash. Horrible, staring faces with empty black eyes and wide, toothless mouths. Around the faces were vaguely drawn symbols, also done in some sort of dark fluid. We all backed up together into the mouth of the cave. Our eyes had adjusted now, and we took in the whole horrible scene. The ceiling of the cave had once been charred black, doubtlessly from countless primitive fires, but now it was shiny with some kind of spray on sealant. There was a fair amount of random-looking spray paint as well, but the overall effect when you looked up was disorientating and ugly. The faces and symbols were up there too, not ash but paint, and not as distinct, but more shadowy, still leering and unnerving. We kept backing out and had a quick meeting to discuss what needed to be done. Here is what we surmised. We had blundered into some sort of active cult sacrificial lair, and to make matters worse, there were people we couldn't see guarding it, communicating with one another through bird calls. The sun was going down. We were stuck on the mountain with a group of snotty, uncooperative teenage girls 50 miles from the nearest town. We had no vehicle until the next day, and we were all in real danger of panicking. We decided that the smartest thing to do was to leave the site immediately and then talk. We gathered the girls, none of whom had seen any of this, and told them in vague terms that it would behoove us to leave as quickly as possible. They picked upon the electricity in the air, and for once didn't argue. We ran. There was no trail. When we left, we went straight across the mountainside, instead of going down first. I almost wish we hadn't, though, because this route offered us a perfect view of the cave for the first half-mile of our jog. After a minute, Raquel stopped me and Jake and pointed back. "Look at the sides of that cave." I looked. On either side of it, facing inward and down, were two enormous faces painted in red and black. We couldn't see them from the way we had come in, and they were really only visible now because the sun was setting, and the orange fiery glow caught the paint in such a way that it reflected a dull sheen into our eyes. It was a mesmerizing scene, until we were snapped out of it by the shadowy figure moving among the bushes above the faces on the rocks. We turned and ran. I looked back and the figure was running too. When we finally turned and started down the mountainside, the going was much easier. We told the girls that we were running so that we would make it back to camp before dark, but they could see the tension among the staff members and started to ask questions. "What was in the cave anyway?" one of them asked as we jogged. I had been about to say nothing when we heard it. The loud pig call we used to locate each other from a distance in the dense underbrush. It was coming from straight ahead, about 100 yards by the sound of it. It must be another group or one of the field directors looking for us, I thought. We were saved. Instantly the other 4 staff and several of the girls answered with a pig call. then silence. We called again, but nothing. Then from behind us and to our right, we heard a loud crashing in the bushes coming towards us fast. I yelled at the girls, "Come this way, quickly!" We bolted at a right angle directly perpendicular to the line between where we had heard the call and where we had heard the crashing. Whoever was crashing through the brush, however, wasn't trying to meet up with the caller. They were tracking us, and they turned where we did. Katie and I moved to the back of the group and told the girls and the other 3 staff to keep running. I wanted to see who was following us. We stopped and the girls moved off. We waited there for half a minute, and then we saw him, or whatever it was. It was dressed all in a dark buckskin, and it was running bent over at the waist, leaping over the smaller bushes and barely trying to dodge the larger ones. It looked more like it was sniffing the ground than it was looking at. From my perspective, I only glimpsed the figure, and then it stopped behind a large juniper tree. Clearly it wasn't going to move until we did, so we decided to give the girls some time, and we turned and walked down the trail they had made. That figure was the last person any of us saw clearly that night, but things kept getting weirder and more frightening. It turns out the group hadn't gone far at all. It was twilight by then, and as we caught up I figured they had stopped, because they didn't know where they were going. But that isn't why they had stopped. We had come again by chance to that red circle of sand with the anthill in the middle of it. The girls were standing in a close circle, staring at something sitting on the anthill. I pressed my way to the middle and looked down. It was a pile of camping gear. More specifically, it was a pile of our camping gear from our campsite, stacked neatly in a pyramid, the way one would mark a trail with rocks for others to follow. Among the items piled there were things that were clearly meant to send a message. There were the unused garbage bags from inside my pack, spare parts for one of the camp stoves from Katie's pack, the sheath of a knife out of Velina's day bag, and beads from Raquel's craft kit. A spearhead Jake had been working on all week lay broken on top of the pile. They had been to our camp. They had been through our things. They knew who the leaders were and where we slept, and they knew who had actually been in the cave and seen it. The girls were quickly freaked out, and they started asking a million questions. Katie quickly silenced them. "Girls, we don't have time for this. It's getting dark. Someone is following us and we don't know why. But what we have to do is get back to camp as quickly as possible and see what else is missing." We quickly staffed up and decided to try the satellite phone. I gave the GPS to one of the others and told them to head straight to camp. I would go at the back and try the phone. We started running again. This time the girls really moved. I had no luck with the phone, which was not a surprise. The global star system had begun to lose satellites and was essentially bankrupt, so finding the right 5-minute window to make a call during the day was like finding, well, a pile of your own camping gear in the middle of a trackless desert. Unlikely. We hit the road after it was fully dark, about half a mile too high on the mountain. There was no moon. We jogged the last half mile down the road and stopped just outside our camp. What if someone was still in there? We kept the girls in a tight group, and 3 of us went in and checked it out. Everything appeared normal, so we brought everyone in. We rounded up the girls' sleeping gear and told them they were all sleeping by the staff tonight. For the first and last time in my experience on the trail, no one argued or complained about it. Once the girls were all in bed, the staff walked towards the road about 20 yards, and we started to talk. We all related our own experiences on the hike back. Velina and I told the others about the bones stacked at the back of the cave, and they filled me in on something I guess I had missed. It seems that whoever had placed our camping gear on the anthill had been there only seconds before the girls found it. A large cloud of dust was hanging in the air as they arrived at the red dirt, and that was actually the reason they had stopped. It was only after they'd stopped that someone spotted the gear. As we were talking, something didn't sit right with Raquel. She suddenly said, "None of this makes sense." We all looked at her. We stumbled onto someone's ritual site, fine. We saw blood and bones, fine. We saw faces painted on the walls and human hair matted into the images, fine. But we didn't take any pictures, and we have no evidence that anything we saw is actually up there. My guess is that everything is cleaned up and gone by now. We all kept looking at her. So why did they chase us? And why are they still out there just beyond those trees? She pointed up the road a little ways, and indeed, there was the shadowy sort of movement that you see when on a dark night something just slightly darker moves through your field of vision. Velina sucked in her breath. "I know why," she said quietly. And out of her bag she pulled 3 clean white bones, sawed off on both ends. My mouth suddenly went dry. One thing about living on the trail is that you learn to make things from every material, so the fact that she had picked up and kept bones was perfectly natural. Just not those bones. Those belonged to someone else. As a group, we decided that the best thing to do was to give them back. 2 of us went back to be with the girls, while 3 of us walked back up the road, where the dark figures had been behind the trees moments before we placed the bones on the ground. I said loudly into the night, actually in a very shaky voice, "Here are your bones. Take them and leave. We have nothing else that belongs to you." Then we turned and went back to camp. Miraculously, the girls were already asleep when we got there. We could hear whispering in the trees. We came together as staff again and decided it would be a good idea to pray. Afterwards, I tried the phone again and got nothing. It was just after midnight, and I knew it was not likely to work again until morning anyway, so I gave up. Above us in the trees, an owl hooted mournfully. Velina chose that occasion to tell us that according to Navajo tradition, if you hear an owl close by in the night, it means someone is going to die. Well, if I'm going to die, I thought, at least it will be with my eyes wide open. I was not going to sleep that night. Around 1 a.m. a faint drumming sound could be heard coming from somewhere close by in the night. The clouds started to roll in, and it began to get darker and darker. As it grew blacker, the people around our camp grew louder. We could hear hushed conversations just beyond the range where we would be able to make out actual words. Everywhere around us it seemed bushes shook and twigs snapped. We were clearly being watched, and the owl would not stop squawking. Blessedly, it started to rain around 3 a.m. The sound of it drowned out any other noise, which on the one hand was a huge relief, and on the other only made matters that much worse. Now it was impossible to tell where the people stalking us might be. At least the owl seemed to have left to find a drier tree. A couple of us got up and set up a quick shelter over the girls to keep them dry. The rain stopped as the first faint lines of grey appeared in the sky. The people, if not gone, were quiet now. I got up to pee in what can only be described as a classic horror movie blunder, and I walked towards the road. I couldn't hear anything, and I began to feel like maybe everyone had left. I was mid-stride when I felt a dramatic shift in the energy around me. I had come to the place where we left the bones just hour before, and my foot was hovering in the air, just outside of the perimeter, past where the bones had been. They were gone now. I pulled it back quickly and stood right there to pee. I don't know what would have happened had I kept walking, but I feel certain that had I crossed that boundary, I would have been taking my life into my own hands. There was a line there in the darkness, On our side of it was the goodness and light that we strove to instill in our group. On the other side there was something much larger and darker than the night. I walked back to camp and went to sleep. Where we slept, we were safe. In the morning, we found that the ground was flattened and worn in almost a perfect circle around where we slept. The footprints were an odd combination. Half of them had shoes and the other half were moccasins or were barefoot. They were everywhere. It was like they tried to come and get us but couldn't approach past a certain point. My footprints where I went to pee were inches from another set of footprints where someone stood almost in my face and watched me. We were finally able to get a phone call out on the satellite phone, and we relayed everything that had happened to us to Shane, our field director. He was out at our group with our replacement staff in record time. Even though it was staff exchange day, the girls were so creeped out that they packed all of their gear without being asked, and as soon as the new staff arrived, they set out hiking away from the area. As we drove back to the office, we went over the details of the last 24 hours with Shane and filled out incident reports. When we got back to town, we filed a police report, and that weekend the sheriff's deputy drove out to the field and hiked up to the cave with Raquel. The bones were gone, the walls scrubbed clean of blood and hair and feces, and the altar in the wall had been chipped away. Everywhere the faces had been was coated with gold and purple spray paint or wax. There was no evidence whatsoever that anything we had seen had ever existed, though it was clear that someone had done a lot of work to clean up the cave recently. At the time we thought it might be good news and that they had moved out of our area, but this proved not to be the case. This was in fact just the beginning of our interactions with this group of people. Apparently we'd pissed them off, and they would follow us and harass us for months afterwards. The next time I would actually see them would be several months later. I was going to be on the trail again for Halloween. Most holidays on the trail are way better than they are off the trail. Christmas was the big one, and I was out there for a lot of those too, but even the minor holidays like Halloween and the 4th of July were times to get excited about. Nothing inordinately special happens on those trail holidays, by most people's standards, but by the time my students had spent a few weeks on the trail away from everything, a simple hot dog or a slice of watermelon is cause enough to rejoice. This Halloween we brought a little candy and some face paints. It was going to be a fun day. We were going to spend the first part of the week tramping around in the Onakis, a day's walk to the north of the Simpson Range, and end up over in the Davis Mountains across the valley. For the first time since July, Katie and I were working together along with one of the new staff named Brian. The boys' group, we were told, was in a really good space. This was rare in the field, considering that most of the kids we worked with had essentially been stolen from their bedrooms in the night and flown to the ugliest part of Utah to spend a few months digging holes to poop in and eating very little food mixed with lots and lots of sand. Ever since the cave incident, as we came to call it, Katie, Raquel and I had become paranoid, and with good reason. Unusual things happened to each of us nearly every time we went to the field. So while we were excited to work together, we were also concerned. Velina no longer worked there. She quit on the ride back to town after the cave incident. Brian had no idea that he should be concerned going into the field, let alone that he was going into the field with two people who were being watched. Watched is what Raquel called it. I called it being systematically terrorized. The last time I had been to the field, I worked with a newer staff named Bill. It was he and I together with only one student. Bill also had no idea that he should be concerned, and until something bad actually happened, I was not going to scare him. The first morning we spent in camp working on some primitive skills instead of hiking. At 10 in the morning we heard a truck pull over on the side of the road, about a half a mile away. Ever since the cave episode, I had been camping much further from the road to make it harder for anyone without our exact coordinates to find us. We thought that the vehicle stopped on the road was one of the transporters bringing us some new batteries for our GPS. When a few minutes later, no one had come to our camp or even yelled to locate us, I started to wonder if maybe I should go find them. As I got up, I heard a high-pitched whistling noise, unlike any I had ever heard before. A small round hole appeared suddenly, right next to me in the tarp I was using as my shelter, and the crack of a high-powered rifle split the air. It took us all of half a second to dive to the ground and crawl for cover as bullets flew past us. We made it to a shallow ditch next to our camp, and the bullets kept coming. Bill started to yell into the trees, "There are people up here, stop shooting!" But the shooting didn't stop. Fortunately, Bill had grabbed the phone box on his belly crawl through the trees, and we fired up the satellite phone. Miraculously, we got a signal immediately, and called the sheriff first. He was going to send someone out to our camp right away. Unfortunately, the closest truck that could get to us was about 70 miles away. We next called our field director, who told us to stay put and he was on his way, and so we waited. The shooting continued for about 6 or 7 minutes, and then it stopped. Bill thought that the shooters might be hunters doing some target practice, thinking that our camp was just some garbage someone had dumped in the desert. He said he was going to run to the road and tell them that there were people up here, and to stop shooting. I told him that I had reason to think that it was intentional, and that I wouldn't try to talk to them at all. After a few more minutes, he got up and started down to the road. Immediately they started shooting again, and I could see little puffs of dirt flying up around his feet. He dove behind a large tree, and this time they aimed at the tree where Bill was laying down. At least they had bad aim. After about 10 more minutes of sporadic gunfire, the shooting stopped again, and a few minutes after that we heard a truck start up and drive off, heading away from town. We stayed there where we were for another half an hour. Our student was crying a little bit, and I talked with him to try and calm him down. When we didn't hear anything else, Bill yelled to me that he was coming over. He crawled most of the way, and then stood up and walked. Amazingly, no one had been hit, and our gear, except for the water jugs which now had holes in them, was mostly salvageable. We hiked in a roundabout and cautious way to a spot on the road where we could hide if a vehicle approached, and waited for the sheriff to arrive. While we waited, we found the spot where the shooters had parked, and from there, where they had hiked in a little ways to where they had a good view of our camp, we found where they stood while they were firing at us. The ground was littered with casings. When the sheriff's deputy arrived, he took down our statement, looked at the tracks on the side of the road, looked at the casings in the bushes, and drove off in the direction that the shooters had gone. We never heard anything back from him. Shane showed up a few minutes later and told us to pack up camp. He drove us further into the field and dropped us off at a completely random location, replaced our water, and told us to meet back up with the rest of the group at the end of the week. He then left as well. We were pretty shaken up, but unharmed. Later that week I woke up one morning to a familiar bird call just outside of camp, and a second bird call answering it from the other side. They had found us, and they were in the camp. Luckily, it had been my recent practice to make everyone sleep really close together, and I could make out the sleeping forms of Bill and our student in the darkness. I tensed for something to happen, but nothing did. They were there, but they were quiet, watching. When I went to the road after first light to retrieve our 5-gallon water jugs, they had been slashed at the base and our water was gone. I informed the other two that our water jugs had both leaked dry, and so we packed quickly and hiked dry the 5.5 miles to our next site. This time we camped under a single massive tree in a wide clearing on a low hill. If they were going to come, we would see them for at least a quarter of a mile. No one came for us. Katie had experienced the same kind of harassment in the preceding weeks. Stolen water, missing gear, bird calls and footprints had plagued whatever group she went to, and once someone had driven into her camp at 3 a.m. and shot up the group shelter with paintball guns and then sped off. We were a little nervous about our upcoming week together, but it started out amazing. The boys really were in a super good space, and aside from a little bit of the usual feet dragging that goes along with trying to get any teenager anywhere to do something productive, they all cooperated and worked together as a group to accomplish everything that needed to be done, quickly and easily. The week was flying by. By Friday, October 31st, things were going swimmingly. We had hiked and set up camp and played games and made bags and backpacks and just had some all-round really good days. The boys were a fun group to be around. They could laugh and joke like most kids do, but when it came to doing the real work that they were sent on the trail to accomplish, they were focused and dedicated too. It was all in all a great week. That morning we decided to leave a little later than usual to start the day's hike. The boys had been so good about hiking that there was no real hurry to start. It was not going to be a very long hike. We were essentially going down a road at the base of the Unaki mountain range to be poised for the next day's hike across the flats, from what are called the Davis Knolls, to the other side of the valley where the Davis Mountains stood. Crossing the valley floor would be a much longer hike. We left in the afternoon and hiked easily the 3.5 miles to our new campsite and began to set up. I had never camped at this particular site before, but as was my newly adopted protocol, we moved quite a ways off of the road before we found a place and set up, and it was growing dark by the time we were settled. Now, setting up camp involves a lot of digging. State and local laws required us to dig a group latrine at each new campsite we moved into, as well as a sump and a fire pit. We also had rules about how deep each hole had to be, and where each hole had to be in relation to camp. The fire pit was obviously at the center of camp, but the sump for the disposal of dirty or soapy water was typically a little more removed, preferably under a tree where no one could step in it. The latrine was the furthest outpost of our campsite. It needed to be far enough out so that one could see you using it, but close enough that everyone could hear you call your name. Katie and Brian took a couple of kids off to dig the latrine, which proved to be difficult, because we were camped in a small rocky valley between 2 eroding hillsides, made mostly of slate-like stone. We never brought shovels on the trail, so each hole had to be dug with a sharpened stick and a perforated coffee can, which we also used to spread the ashes of our fires each day. I worked with some of the others on getting the fire pit set up, and supervised the digging of the sump. Where we were camped, a fire had swept through the area a few years back, leaving most of the trees standing upright as blackened wooden corpses. The sage had all been burnt off as well, so the native prairie grass that once dominated the area before the sage invaded was thick and tall. When camp was all set up, we brought out the candy and the face paints we'd brought in just for Halloween, and the kids went crazy. Picture the kind of celebration that would be expected upon, say, your first big meal after being released from prison, and you might approximate the kind of joy that occurs in the heart of a teenage sugar addict after being forced to forego sugar for a month and then suddenly being handed a fistful of chocolate. Just after dark, the wind picked up. For the end of October, it had been a pretty warm day, but now with the wind and the lack of sun, it was swiftly turning seasonably cold. I stood up from the fire to go retrieve my hat from my bag, and was temporarily blind as I made my way through the dark to my stuff. I found my hat and was turning to go back to the kids, when I saw him. It was a thin, short figure walking at an angle, away from the fire about 30 feet from where I stood. I must have walked right past him in the darkness, or maybe he had followed me and watched me. I couldn't see who it was, and he disappeared into the trees a second later. I put on my hat and went back to the fire to see who was missing, because whoever it was not calling their name. No one was missing. Everyone, staff and students, were accounted for. I asked if anyone had been up since I had left, and no one had. I didn't want to alarm anyone, so I didn't say anything else. But after a minute, Katie pulled me aside and asked what was wrong. I told her that I had seen someone in the trees, and that they had been wearing the same gear that the students in the program wore, but that everyone was accounted for when I got back. This was concerning for a number of reasons. First of all, it had been our recent experience that it is never a good thing to have extra people around camp, especially people that lurk in the bushes and refuse to introduce themselves. Secondly, a lot of the gear that the kids used was not readily available to the public. It was stuff specially ordered from small suppliers all over the world, brands that one usually doesn't see anywhere but on the kids in the field. This meant that earlier someone had come into one of our camps and stolen it. Or worse, someone working for the company was providing whoever it was with gear. The second theory explained a lot. This had bothered us ever since the cave incident. None of the staff in any of the other groups ever reported being harassed. How did they always know which groups we 3 staff would be in? How could they locate us when we went to extreme efforts to hide our camps from the roads and trails? The best explanation we could come up with was also the most chilling. They knew because someone we worked with was telling them. Katie and I went back to the fire and sat quietly. I, for my part, tried to remain engaged with the group, but mostly I was listening intensely to the night around us. Clouds started to move in, and it grew late. We sent everyone to bed and set about collecting the students' boots, and as I gathered the last boot, one of the boys said quietly, "There were people out there tonight, weren't there?" I paused, unsure of how to answer. "Why do you say that?" I responded. "I saw them by the latrine on the hill," he said simply. "We all saw them." "I think it was the field director and the office staff doing an evaluation on our group," I lied. "Sometimes they do that. They want to see if we're keeping the rules when we think no one is watching." "How do you think we did?" I asked. "You're lying," he said. "I am?" I responded. It was more of a statement than a question. When everyone was in bed, I moved my sleeping gear closer to the center of camp. I determined that the best thing to do would be to try and get some sleep. Even though I had nearly been shot or otherwise unpleasantly killed through sabotage and dehydration in the last few months by these people, it had always been okay, and I had no reason to think otherwise now. I went to bed. At several points in the night I heard voices around us, but that was old news. It seemed now that there were always voices around us, and at one point they moved directly through camp and out the other side. I got up and checked on all of the boys. Everyone was fine, but there was a certain feel to the air around us. It felt dirty. They came through camp one more time that night, this time from a different direction altogether, passing quite close to where I lay sleepless. The clouds had cleared and the moon, though not full, was bright. I saw them then. There were about 20 of them. Some of them dressed as students like I had seen before. Others, who seemed to be much older, wore dark, loose-fitting clothing. And one, who I recognized immediately from the cave, wore dark buckskin and stooped at the waist as he walked among the dead trees. I shut my eyes and didn't open them again until morning. In the morning, while it was still a little bit dark, and well before anyone else awoke, Katie got up. She later said to the other staff, and to the field director, that it was to use the latrine, but I suspect that it was really because she needed to make certain that everyone was okay. I was still awake, having not slept most of the night, and heard her moving around. After a few minutes she came and got me. "Dan, you need to come see this. Silently, I got up and followed her to where they had dug the latrine the night before. There beside it was a pile of fresh bones. They still had bits of meat on them. I looked at her and knew what we had to do. We had to hide them from the students. We ended up digging another hole and burying them. And as the students started to wake up, I decided to go and look to see if I could find any tracks. They were all over the place, of course, not hard to follow at all. I moved further and further out as the day lightened, and suddenly stopped in a stand of unburnt trees, not quite sure what I was looking at. It had recently been some kind of animal, but it had been shaved and mutilated to a point almost beyond recognition. It was a lamb. Now there are a lot of sheep herders in the West Desert. They show up every year just as the snow melts, and then pack up their animals and leave as soon as the snow starts to fall again. I had come across the remains of lots of sheep in my time out there, but none were like this, and none had been so fresh. There were no signs of animals eating the carcass, and yet the meat clearly appeared to be several days old. What was most disturbing about it were the markings on its skin. They looked uncannily like the paint markings we had seen in the cave, only these had been cut into the skin and then left to rot. I nearly threw up a little. As I walked back to camp, I saw someone walking towards me through the dead trees. I crouched down to get a better look before they spotted me, and after a minute I stood up, relieved. It was Raquel. I walked up and gave her a big hug. "What are you doing out here so early?" I asked. "I'm here to pick up one of your kids. He's going home today." As we walked towards camp, I quietly explained to her what I had found. When we got to the edge of camp, I motioned for Katie to join us. Brian stood up and followed too, so I stopped and told him that someone needed to stay with the boys. I didn't trust him or anyone else that had recently started working for the program. Later that would change, but for now I was cautious. I took them to the carcass, and Raquel stiffened as she saw it. "This is bad, you guys," she said quietly. "Where are its bones?" she asked next. I looked at the body on the ground, so that was what was so weird about it. Most of its bones were gone. Katie and I told her about the pile next to the latrine. She didn't say anything for a while. She looked back towards camp and then down towards the latrine, and then said something unexpected. "This is south, and that," she said, pointing at the latrine, "is west. Have you looked east or north yet?" "East of north of what?" I asked dumbly. "Of camp," she replied. I looked again. We were indeed directly south of camp, about 200 yards from the fire pit, but out of sight. The latrine was on the same arc as us, about 200 yards from the fire pit, but directly west of camp and also out of sight. We all looked east and started walking. After a few yards I stopped and said, "We need to bury it first." "We'll do it later," Raquel said, and so we kept walking. 200 yards directly east of the fire pit was the road. At first there didn't appear to be anything out of the ordinary, just an oil stain in the dirt. We looked around some more and could find nothing, so we gathered back on the road and looked at the oil stain a little closer. It wasn't oil. It didn't exactly appear to be blood either, at least not all blood. It seems that they had drained all the fluids from the body and mixed them together into a cocktail and poured it in a sweeping smudge in the dirt. It was nasty. We kicked dirt over it and left quickly, heading north without saying much. I think we all felt dirty more than we'd felt scared. At the point 200 yards north of the fire pit, there was a great ball of matted grey and white wool. I thought to myself, "Oh no, not wool," and smiled a little. But then I remembered what I had felt the night before as they passed through the camp, and I quit smiling. What needed to be done was clear. The only thing that the group might recognize as a problem was the carcass itself, and so we moved it and buried it. While we were looking for a suitable spot to dispose of it, we came across several more dead sheep. These were much closer to camp and much older. There were lots of tracks around these ones too, but I couldn't tell if they had been slaughtered like the first one we had found, or if a mountain lion or coyote had killed them. Either way, I wanted to get out of there. After breakfast, while we were packing, Brian approached me and told me that some weird stuff had gone on the night before. He had seen people in camp, but when he got up to follow them, he had a really bad feeling about it, so he got back into bed. "What is going on out here?" he demanded. Katie, Raquel, and I told him about the cave, and the followings, and the dead dismembered sheep around camp. Brian just listened and swore under his breath every once in a while. After Raquel left, we quickly packed and hiked the 7 miles to our next campsite. We made it to the Davis Mountains in pretty good time. On the way, we ran into the herd of wild horses that lived in our field area. They were spooked as we got closer, and then ran off. It felt better over here, like we were out from under a dark shadow. We filled out our incident reports in the sun, documenting to the best of our ability all the weird things that we found, and waited for the night to come. Nothing else happened that week. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.